Zara's heart raced as she crouched low in the corner of the crumbling structure, her breath shallow, trying to make as little noise as possible. The planet was nothing like the warm, vibrant world she had once known. Here, the air was thick and heavy, the sky a constant shade of orange, with strange clouds that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, cracked, and covered in dense fog that made it nearly impossible to see. But worse than the environment were the creatures that roamed this place. Monsters, monstrous in size, appearance, and strength. Zara had never been afraid of dying. But this world was a new kind of terror. Her people had left her here, abandoned her on this hostile planet. She had tried to send a distress signal, but the communication equipment was damaged beyond repair. Her ship's emergency landing had been nothing but a cruel trick. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a place to gather supplies before they could escape. Instead, the moment her feet hit the ground, her crew turned against her, leaving her to fend for herself. The silence of the ruins around her seemed to press in on Zara, making her feel smaller, weaker. Her pulse thudded in her ears as the sounds of something approaching grew louder. She peeked out from behind a broken wall, eyes wide and alert. There, through the fog, she could see large shapes moving, sniffing the air, searching for anything that might provide them with a meal. The creatures had strange, glowing eyes and sharp claws. They were relentless and unforgiving. Zara didn't know how long she had been hiding like this. Days, maybe weeks. The creatures came and went, prowling, sniffing, and sometimes fighting each other. But none had come close enough to her hiding spot. Until now. She held her breath, clutching the small weapon she had left. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The energy pack was low, but if she could make it last, she could put up a fight. Suddenly, the ground beneath her trembled. Zara's eyes shot toward the source of the disturbance. A massive beast, larger than anything she had encountered before, appeared from the mist. Its scales shimmered under the dim light, and its huge, slithering body was almost too large to comprehend. She tried not to make a sound as she pressed herself further into the corner. There was no escape now. The creature paused, sniffing the air, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. The wind shifted, and the creature's head turned toward her hiding place. She couldn't move, couldn't run. If it came any closer, she would have no chance. She could feel her body tremble in fear, but she didn't dare to make a sound. The creature's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, Zara thought it might strike. Then, from out of nowhere, a loud noise erupted. A blaster shot, followed by a second, and then a third. The creature's head jerked back, distracted, and Zara seized the opportunity to scramble away. She didn't know what or who had fired the shots, but she wasn't going to wait around to find out. Before she could move far, another figure appeared in the mist. The figure was human. Zara froze, eyes wide with caution. She hadn't seen a human in years, and certainly not in a place like this. What was one doing on this cursed planet? The human stood tall, his clothing a mixture of scavenged armor and rough fabric, worn from countless battles with the planet's creatures. He aimed his weapon at the massive beast, firing a few more shots. The creature shrieked in pain and retreated into the fog, disappearing as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, the human and Zara simply stared at each other. There was no immediate hostility, but Zara could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure if the human saw her as a threat or just another strange alien to deal with. "Are you all right?" The human finally spoke, his voice rough but not unkind. Zara didn't answer immediately. Trust didn't come easy, especially not in a place like this. The human seemed too calm for someone who had just rescued her from a giant monster. "I'm not interested in fighting," the human said, taking a cautious step forward. "But I suggest you don't make any sudden moves." Zara couldn't help but wonder who this human was, and why he was here. "Why did you help me?" she asked cautiously, her voice shaky. The creature moved quickly, too fast for Ethan to get another shot. He reached for a second weapon, something smaller, sleeker, and more precise. He fired again, hitting the creature in the side. This time, the beast stumbled, letting out a shrill cry of pain. It wasn't enough to kill it, but it slowed the creature down. Ethan seized the opportunity, grabbing Zara's arm and pulling her to her feet. "Run," Ethan ordered, his voice filled with urgency. Without hesitation, Zara followed his lead. They sprinted down the narrow alley, the sounds of the creature's growls and the pounding of its feet close behind. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, and Zara's mind raced. Where could they go? The base that Ethan had promised was still miles away. They couldn't stop now. Not when the creature was still hunting them. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he picked up his pace. "We're almost there. Just keep going." Zara didn't know where there was, but she trusted him. She pushed her body to its limits, her feet pounding against the cracked ground, trying to outrun the creature that was closing in on them. The adrenaline coursed through her, making her feel lighter, faster, even as her body screamed for rest. The creature's growl grew louder, closer. Zara's heart raced, and she could hear the rapid footsteps behind them. She couldn't keep up this pace for much longer. Her energy was draining, but the thought of being caught by the monster drove her forward. Suddenly, Ethan stopped, pulling Zara to a halt with a firm grip on her arm. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, and saw that his expression had shifted from focused determination to something darker. He was staring at the edge of the alley where a large metal door stood, half hidden behind the rubble. It was their only chance. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice low and serious. "Get inside. Now." Without waiting for her reply, he shoved the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Zara rushed inside, her legs trembling from the effort of running, and Ethan followed closely behind, slamming the door shut just as the creature's roar echoed from the alley. They both collapsed against the door, their breathing heavy. The room was silent now, save for the sound of their labored breaths. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zara looked at Ethan, her mind still racing with everything that had happened in the last few minutes. They had narrowly escaped death, but they weren't safe yet. She knew the creature was still out there, and there were more dangers waiting for them in the shadows. Ethan finally broke the silence. "That was too close, but we made it." Zara nodded, though the fear was still there. They had survived for now, but the journey was far from over. They still had a long way to go, and she didn't know what other threats awaited them. "Thanks," she said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "I couldn't have done this without you." Ethan gave her a small, tired smile. "We're in this together." The small room they had taken refuge in was dark, its only light coming from a dimly flickering light bulb in the corner. Ethan leaned against the door, his breath still coming in heavy gasps as he listened intently. The sounds of the creature's growls faded into the distance, but they weren't completely gone. The air felt thick, as if the danger was still close, watching them from the shadows. Zara stood near the corner, her body trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush that had overtaken her. Her heart was still pounding, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to be weak now. They had just survived a terrifying encounter, but they were far from safe. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's gone?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the room, his eyes narrowing as he checked for any possible escape routes. He walked across the room, testing a few of the crates stacked in the corner, his movements sharp and purposeful. Then he turned to her. "It's not gone," he said quietly. "But we've bought ourselves some time. We need to keep moving." Zara's brow furrowed as she tried to process his words. "But where do we go? The city is full of monsters. We're stuck here." Ethan's expression softened for a moment. He stepped closer to her, his eyes filled with determination. "We're not stuck. There's a place, a safe place, where we can regroup and plan our next move. It's not far from here, but we have to move quickly." Zara's heart skipped a beat. A safe place. You're sure? Ethan nodded. I'm sure. I've been there before. It's a hidden shelter, built by people who escaped the chaos. It's not much, but it's enough to rest and figure out our next steps. But we need to leave now. The longer we stay here, the more chances we have of being found. Zara's heart tightened. She could understand the pain in his voice. She had felt that same loneliness and betrayal when her own crew had abandoned her. The cruelty of it all was unbearable. I'm sorry, she said softly, not sure what else to say. Ethan nodded once, though his face remained stoic. It's in the past. What matters now is surviving. Zara said nothing more. She didn't know what else she could say. There was nothing that could change what had happened to him, just as there was nothing that could change what had happened to her. All that mattered now was moving forward. The journey continued in silence, the only sounds being their footsteps and the occasional distant roar of the creatures in the fog. The terrain was difficult, and they had to be careful, stepping over broken debris and navigating around deep cracks in the earth. Zara stumbled once, but Ethan was there to catch her, his hand steady and sure. She hadn't realized how much she had been relying on him until that moment. We should reach the base in another few hours, Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. Stay alert. The closer we get, the more dangerous it gets. Zara nodded, her mind racing. What kind of dangers could be waiting ahead? She had already seen how ruthless the creatures were, but there was something in Ethan's voice that made her think there was more to fear than just the beasts. The human world was dangerous too. They moved on, pushing forward through the thick fog. The air was heavy, the weight of it pressing down on them. As they passed through a narrow alley between two ruined buildings, a loud noise echoed in the distance, a guttural growl followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Ethan's hand immediately went to his weapon, his body tensing. Stay close, he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Zara's heart raced. She had no idea what was coming, but she could feel the danger in the air. Something was out there. She had no choice but to trust Ethan. She moved closer to him, her breath shallow as they continued forward, ready for whatever came next. The eerie silence that had settled around them was broken by another growl, this time much closer. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon, his eyes scanning the fog with a sharpened focus. Zara's heart pounded in her chest, her senses alert to the danger that was steadily approaching. Stay behind me, Ethan whispered urgently, stepping in front of her, his body tense as he braced himself for whatever was coming. Zara didn't argue. She understood the gravity of the situation. She had survived on her own for so long, but facing whatever was lurking in the fog was a new kind of fear. She had no idea what kind of creature it could be, but Ethan's steady stance told her one thing. It wasn't the first time he had faced such a threat. The growls continued, echoing in the distance, but they were getting closer. The ground beneath them seemed to shift as if something large was moving through the ruined city. The air felt heavier, thick with the smell of decay and dust. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his breath slow and steady. Whatever it is, we don't want to be here when it gets close, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Zara's pulse quickened. She had no idea how they would escape this, but she trusted Ethan. He seemed to know what he was doing. She stepped closer to him, her eyes scanning the fog, trying to see through the murky air. But everything was cloaked in darkness, hiding the creatures waiting just beyond her reach. Then, with a sudden movement, a large shadow emerged from the fog. Zara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shape was massive, its eyes glowing a fierce yellow as it locked onto them. The creature was unlike anything Zara had ever seen. Its body was built like a beast, covered in jagged scales that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. Its teeth were sharp and deadly, its claws long and curved, capable of tearing through anything in its path. It roared, a sound so deafening that it made the ground beneath their feet vibrate. The creature's gaze flickered from Ethan to Zara, its mouth opening wide, as if deciding which of them to attack first. "Move," Ethan shouted, pushing Zara to the side as he raised his weapon, aiming directly at the creature. Zara barely had time to react. She stumbled but managed to regain her balance just in time to see Ethan fire. A bright flash erupted from the weapon, and the creature recoiled, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The beast let out a furious growl, its massive claws swiping through the air. Ethan darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's swipe. Zara could feel the wind from the creature's claws as it swiped inches from her. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let fear control her. Not now. Zara's heart raced as she crouched low in the corner of the crumbling structure, her breath shallow, trying to make as little noise as possible. The planet was nothing like the warm, vibrant world she had once known. Here, the air was thick and heavy, the sky a constant shade of orange, with strange clouds that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, cracked, and covered in dense fog that made it nearly impossible to see. But worse than the environment were the creatures that roamed this place. Monsters, monstrous in size, appearance, and strength. Zara had never been afraid of dying. But this world was a new kind of terror. Her people had left her here, abandoned her on this hostile planet. She had tried to send a distress signal, but the communication equipment was damaged beyond repair. Her ship's emergency landing had been nothing but a cruel trick. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a place to gather supplies before they could escape. Instead, the moment her feet hit the ground, her crew turned against her, leaving her to fend for herself. The silence of the ruins around her seemed to press in on Zara, making her feel smaller, weaker. Her pulse thudded in her ears as the sounds of something approaching grew louder. She peeked out from behind a broken wall, eyes wide and alert. There, through the fog, she could see large shapes moving, sniffing the air, searching for anything that might provide them with a meal. The creatures had strange, glowing eyes and sharp claws. They were relentless and unforgiving. Zara didn't know how long she had been hiding like this. Days, maybe weeks. The creatures came and went, prowling, sniffing, and sometimes fighting each other. But none had come close enough to her hiding spot. Until now. She held her breath, clutching the small weapon she had left. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The energy pack was low, but if she could make it last, she could put up a fight. Suddenly, the ground beneath her trembled. Zara's eyes shot toward the source of the disturbance. A massive beast, larger than anything she had encountered before, appeared from the mist. Its scales shimmered under the dim light, and its huge, slithering body was almost too large to comprehend. She tried not to make a sound as she pressed herself further into the corner. There was no escape now. The creature paused, sniffing the air, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. The wind shifted, and the creature's head turned toward her hiding place. She couldn't move, couldn't run. If it came any closer, she would have no chance. She could feel her body tremble in fear, but she didn't dare to make a sound. The creature's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, Zara thought it might strike. Then, from out of nowhere, a loud noise erupted, a blaster shot, followed by a second, and then a third. The creature's head jerked back, distracted, and Zara seized the opportunity to scramble away. She didn't know what or who had fired the shots, but she wasn't going to wait around to find out. Before she could move far, another figure appeared in the mist. The figure was human. Zara froze, eyes wide with caution. She hadn't seen a human in years, and certainly not in a place like this. What was one doing on this cursed planet? The human stood tall, his clothing a mixture of scavenged armor and rough fabric, worn from countless battles with the planet's creatures. He aimed his weapon at the massive beast, firing a few more shots. The creature shrieked in pain and retreated into the fog, disappearing as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, the human and Zara simply stared at each other. There was no immediate hostility, but Zara could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure if the human saw her as a threat or just another strange alien to deal with. "Are you all right?" The human finally spoke, his voice rough but not unkind. Zara didn't answer immediately. Trust didn't come easy, especially not in a place like this. The human seemed too calm for someone who had just rescued her from a giant monster. "I'm not interested in fighting," the human said, taking a cautious step forward. "But I suggest you don't make any sudden moves." Zara couldn't help but wonder who this human was, and why he was here. "Why did you help me?" she asked cautiously, her voice shaky. Zara's mind raced. A safe place. After all the chaos, the monsters, and the unknowns, the idea of safety felt like a distant dream. But if there was even a chance, she couldn't ignore it. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that still clung to her. "Let's go." Ethan gave her a quick nod, his hand resting on the door handle. He peered through the small crack, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings outside. After a moment, he opened the door just enough to slip through, motioning for Sarah to follow. The outside world was still cloaked in fog, the streets eerily quiet. The distant howls and growls of creatures filled the air, a constant reminder that danger was never far away. The buildings around them stood like silent giants, their broken windows and collapsed walls offering no protection. It was a city in ruin, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over her as they moved through the empty streets. Ethan led the way, his footsteps steady and purposeful. Zara followed closely, her senses alert to every sound, every movement. The fog made it harder to see, but she trusted Ethan. He knew the city, and he seemed to know where they were going. "We're getting close," Ethan said quietly after a while. His voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the tension beneath it. Zara's heart began to race again. She had no idea what to expect from this shelter, but the thought of safety was enough to keep her going. She couldn't let herself falter now. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop until they reached that safe place. As they rounded a corner, they came upon a narrow alleyway, barely visible in the thick fog. Ethan stopped, holding up a hand to signal Sarah to do the same. He moved to the wall and pressed his hand against it, feeling for something hidden in the stone. After a moment, a low click echoed in the silence, and a hidden door slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit hallway. "This is it," Ethan said, stepping inside. Zara followed, her breath catching in her throat as she entered the dark, quiet shelter. It was small, but it was a welcome refuge. The air inside was stale, but it didn't matter. It was safe. Ethan closed the door behind them, locking it with a soft click. Zara looked around, taking in the sparse furnishings, some old crates, a few chairs, and a table in a corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a place where they could rest and plan, a place where they could survive. Ethan set down his pack and sat at the table, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, but there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that Sarah admired. She could see the weight of the journey in his posture, the toll it had taken on him. But she also saw something else, a hope that was beginning to spark. "This is only temporary," Ethan said after a long pause. "We'll rest here, get our strength back, and then we'll head out again. There are others out there, survivors like us." Zara nodded, her mind still processing everything. "Do you think we'll find them? Other survivors?" Ethan looked at her, his expression firm. "I know we will. There's always hope, Zara. We just have to keep moving forward." She looked at him, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Hope. It had been so long since she had felt that. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them after all. The shelter was silent, the kind of silence that made Sarah feel small, vulnerable. The faint hum of the distant creatures outside reminded her that they were not safe. Not truly. They had only bought themselves a little time, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was only a momentary illusion. Ethan had been quiet for a while now, his back against the wall as he stared out the small, cracked window at the fog-covered city beyond. His eyes looked distant, as if he was somewhere far away in his thoughts. Zara wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but she didn't know how to break the stillness that hung in the air. After a few minutes, Ethan sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of their situation. "We can't stay here forever. As much as I wish we could rest more, the longer we're stuck, the harder it'll be to move." Zara glanced around the room. "We've barely had a chance to recover. The city is a maze of danger. How can we move forward when we don't know where to go?" Ethan looked at her then, his gaze sharp but understanding. "I know it's not easy, but the more we stay in one place, the more likely it is that we'll be found. We need to keep moving to stay ahead of the creatures. We don't know what's out there, but we know one thing for sure. We can't wait for them to find us. Not here." "Stay close," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of distant creatures. They moved swiftly, sticking to the alleyways as much as possible, avoiding the main roads where they knew the monsters roamed. Every step felt like a battle against their own fear. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was almost as terrifying as the thought of being caught. Zara glanced at Ethan. He was always alert, scanning their surroundings with a sharpness that made her feel a little safer. But she knew that even his skill couldn't guarantee they wouldn't be spotted. "Do you think we'll make it?" Zara asked, her voice trembling slightly. She hated how weak she sounded, but the fear inside her was hard to control. Ethan looked at her, his expression serious but reassuring. "We're going to make it. We've come this far. We just need to keep moving." They kept walking, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog. Time seemed to stretch, the hours blurring together as they navigated the dangerous streets. Every now and then, Zara would hear something. An echo of a creature's call, the rustling of something in the shadows. But Ethan would gesture for her to keep moving, never stopping for long. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of the city that things started to feel different. The buildings were less crowded, the streets more open. But with the open spaces came the risk of being exposed. They couldn't hide in the alleyways anymore. Every step forward felt like walking into the jaws of danger. "Almost there," Ethan said, his voice tight. Zara glanced at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the military base in the distance, a crumbling fortress that had once been a symbol of strength. Now it was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The walls were broken, the gates rusted and ajar. But it was their only chance. They moved faster now, the final stretch ahead of them. But as they approached the base, a loud guttural roar echoed through the streets. Zara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was unmistakable. One of the creatures was near. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a nearby building. They ducked behind the rubble, trying to stay out of sight. Zara's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she watched the street, her eyes wide with terror. "I knew this would happen," Ethan muttered, his voice low but fierce. "We need to keep moving, but we have to be careful. If we're caught now, we won't make it." Zara nodded, her hands trembling. She could hear the creature's footsteps, heavy and echoing, getting closer. It was almost as if it could sense them. Ethan peeked around the corner, then looked back at her. "On my signal, we run. Get ready." Zara's heart was pounding, but she did her best to stay calm. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. She had to trust Ethan. Trust that he knew what he was doing. "Now," Ethan hissed. Without thinking, Zara sprinted forward, her feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The sound of the creature's roar grew louder, but they didn't stop. The military base was so close now, just a few hundred yards away. The distance between them and safety was almost within reach. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the creature burst into view, its monstrous form emerging from the fog. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and for a moment, Zara thought they were done for. But Ethan was faster. He pushed her toward the gate, urging her forward. "Go, go," he shouted. With every ounce of strength, Zara ran, her legs aching, her breath ragged. The gate was within reach now, and she could see the promise of safety on the other side. Ethan was right behind her, his gun raised, ready to defend them if needed. They reached the gate, and as Sarah shoved it open, she heard the creatures roar once again. But they were already inside, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. They had made it. They were safe, at least for now. The human looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't help you. I helped me. Those things are a pain to deal with." Zara narrowed her eyes, unsure if he was being serious. But for now, it didn't matter. He had just saved her life. The human gave a nod, as if deciding something in his mind. "You can either sit here and wait to be eaten, or you can follow me. I'm heading to the next safe zone. If you're smart, you'll keep up." Zara hesitated. The world she had known was gone. Her crew had left her. And now, the planet itself seemed determined to end her life. Perhaps, just perhaps, this human could offer her a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly. "Lead the way." And so, without any real trust, but with a shared goal of survival, they began to walk through the fog together. The monstrous world around them seemed even darker now, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah wasn't alone. Sarah kept her distance as she followed the human through the fog-covered wasteland. His steps were swift and sure, like he knew the terrain well. Zara, on the other hand, was careful, watching every shadow, every movement, unsure of what might be lurking just out of sight. She had been alone for so long, distrustful of everyone, but now she found herself walking beside a human, a species she had been taught to fear. The human didn't speak much. He led the way, glancing back at Sarah occasionally to make sure she was still there. His name, he had said, was Ethan. His voice was rough, as though he had been living on the edge for years, fighting to survive in this unforgiving world. Zara found herself wondering what had brought him to this strange, dangerous planet. Most humans, she knew, wouldn't dare set foot here. They would rather avoid the monsters and the ruin. But this human, Ethan, seemed different. There was something about him that made her think he was no stranger to danger. After a long silence, Ethan spoke, his tone casual but serious. "So, you never told me what you're doing here." Zara was caught off guard. She had been so focused on surviving, on the terror of being abandoned, that she hadn't even thought about explaining herself. "I was left here," she finally said, her voice low. "My ship was damaged, and my crew decided I was no longer useful." She hesitated, memories of the betrayal fresh in her mind. "They left me behind, abandoned me." Ethan didn't say anything right away. He just kept walking, his eyes scanning the environment. Zara couldn't tell what he was thinking. Maybe he felt sorry for her, or maybe he thought her story was just another alien tale. "I'm sorry," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. "No one should be left behind like that." Zara glanced at him. She hadn't expected sympathy. Not from a human. "It's not your fault," she replied. "I don't expect anyone to save me. I never did. But here I am." Ethan gave her a small nod, though he still didn't say much. They continued walking in silence for a while longer, with Sarah keeping her distance, both out of caution and habit. She didn't trust easily, not since the betrayal of her own people. The ruins they walked through were eerily silent, save for the occasional howl of some distant beast. As they moved deeper into the abandoned city, Zara noticed how Ethan seemed to move with purpose, like he was used to this sort of place. He knew the layout, where to step, what to avoid. She could tell he had been living here for a long time, scavenging, fighting, surviving. They reached a small shelter, an old building that seemed to have been a storage facility of some sort. It was sturdy, and Ethan led Sarah inside. The air was stale, but at least it was safe for the moment. Ethan set down his pack and motioned for Sarah to sit. She hesitated before doing so, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Take a break," Ethan said, his voice calm. "We're safe here for now." Sarah sat down, her body aching from the long walk and constant tension. The weariness she had been fighting finally began to settle in. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she had last slept. Days, weeks. Time had become a blur. Ethan rummaged through his pack, pulling out a small dried ration. He handed it to her without a word. Zara accepted it reluctantly. She hadn't eaten much since her crew had left her behind, and the hunger gnawed at her stomach. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't sure what else to say. The food was bland, but it was something. Anything was better than nothing. Ethan ate his own share, then sat back against the wall, his expression unreadable. Zara watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You've been living here for a while, haven't you?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ethan gave her a brief glance, but didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he said, "Yeah, I've been here longer than I care to admit." He looked away, his gaze distant. "I came here on a mission, like you, but things went south fast." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "What happened?" Ethan let out a long sigh, shaking his head. "My crew, they made a mistake. The mission was supposed to be simple: find some supplies, salvage what we could, and get out. But the creatures, the ones you saw earlier, they're not the worst part of this place. The real danger is other people, the ones who come here to take what doesn't belong to them." Zara nodded slowly, understanding all too well the kind of people Ethan was talking about. She had seen it on her own ship, the greed, the ruthlessness. In a way, it was easier to understand why she had been left behind. She had never fit in with the others. She wasn't like them, and now she was alone. The silence grew heavy between them, but this time, it was different. There was no longer any judgment, no need for walls. They were both survivors, both forced to adapt to a world that was not kind. "Thank you," Zara said again, breaking the quiet. "For helping me." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. His actions spoke louder than words. In that moment, Sarah realized that this uneasy alliance, this strange pairing of alien and human, might just be her only hope. They both had their reasons for surviving, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could survive together. The shelter they had found wasn't much, but it was a rare blessing in this desolate land. The walls, though cracked and stained with age, provided protection from the worst of the storms and creatures that roamed outside. Zara sat against the cold wall, her eyes drifting shut, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. But just as she was about to rest, Ethan stood up, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon outside the shelter. "We need to move," he said quietly, his tone serious. Zara opened her eyes and straightened, sitting up fully. "Move? Why? We're safe here." Ethan shook his head. "We might be safe for now, but it won't last. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely it is that someone or something will find us." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't want to leave the only shelter she had found, but she knew he was right. The world outside was dangerous. The creatures, the ruins, everything here seemed determined to tear her apart. And Ethan, well, he had been surviving for longer than she could even imagine. If he said they needed to move, she would follow. "All right," she said, her voice low. "What's the plan?" Ethan looked down at his pack, checking his supplies. "We're heading to an old base of mine. It's a couple of days away, but it's secure. We can rest there, get more supplies, and figure out our next move." Zara nodded, though she wasn't sure what to expect. She had no idea where they were going, what dangers lay between them and that base. But she trusted Ethan. At least, she trusted him more than she trusted the monsters outside. Without another word, Ethan led the way, and Sarah followed closely behind. The fog was thick, wrapping around them like a blanket. Visibility was poor, and each step they took seemed to echo in the silence of the abandoned city. There were no signs of life, no sound of other travelers, just the constant howling of the wind and the distant growls of the creatures. Ethan moved with purpose, taking careful steps, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Sarah kept close, her senses on high alert. Every time a sound came from the shadows, her heart raced. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. As they moved through the ruins, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about Ethan. Who was he really? What had brought him to this forsaken planet? He seemed to know so much about the dangers here, yet he remained quiet about his past. She wasn't sure if she should ask, or if it was better to just focus on surviving. But she couldn't help herself. "So, Ethan," she began, her voice quiet. "Why are you here? What happened to your crew?" Ethan didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might ignore her question. But then, he stopped and turned to face her, his expression hard. "It's not something I like to talk about," he said, his voice low. "But if you must know, I was part of a search mission. My crew and I were sent to this planet to retrieve some valuable resources, but things went wrong. My crew," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "They turned on me, left me to die out here.